I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about Wonder Women. Mr. Green! Mr. Green!
Actually, no, we're not. Our purpose today is to figure out in what respects were the new cultures of the mid-19th century, those of utopian communalists and of urban residents, different from the mainstream culture described in chapters 8 and 9. How are they alike? So basically, I'm going to teach you a little bit about what the culture was in chapter 11 and then compare it to the cultures we discussed in chapters 8 and 9. So let's quickly review. Chapter 8 is all about the creation of Republican culture. There were new relationships based on Republican ideas. The First Great Awakening happened in this chapter, as well as the Missouri Crisis. And Chapter 9 is all about the economic transformation. This is the Industrial Revolution. There is a lot of immigration, mostly German and Irish, and this is also the movement towards the benevolent empire. Oh, and last but not least, we have Chapter 11, the chapter I'll be teaching you a little bit about and then comparing to the other ones. It's the religion and reforming movements. In this chapter, we discuss the new religious sects that were coming about between 1820 and 1860, the utopian communities, and the urban city centers, as well as abolitionism and reformation. First, we're going to compare and contrast the First and Second Great Awakenings. The First Great Awakening is in Chapter 8, and the Second Great Awakening is in Chapter 11. The First and Second Great Awakenings were alike in that they were both great and awakish. The First Great Awakening was a movement in response to the religious skepticism the Enlightenment produced. Ministers stressed the emptiness of materials and the need to repent right now. If you didn't repent, then God was going to show his fury and you were going to burn in hell. And many ministers founded universities to spread their teachings, and many of them are Ivy League schools today. The Second Great Awakening, however, was about 100 years after the first, and it wasn't a single movement like the First Great Awakening. It had a clear beginning in 1732, and then everything caught fire in different times in different parts of the country. And there was a much different focus for this movement. The First Great Awakening is called the Whitefield Great Awakening. Clergy started preaching in new and crazy and super theatrical ways. The ideas of deism and pietism were born, and there was a higher level of religious tolerance. Evangelism was born in the Second Great Awakening, and there was a bigger focus on women in churches, which was good because there wasn't a focus on women in churches before. The Second Great Awakening is sometimes called the Women's Great Awakening because it was primarily women who played a part in the Great Awakening.
Religion moved past social barriers to less wealthy and less educated, and there was a big focus on habitary reform such as temperance, abolition, dress, and tobacco. There was also new religious sects in America at this time.
Fourierism is a system for the reorganization of society into self-sufficient cooperatives, such as utopias. And by the way, that's utopia, not dystopia. A utopian society is a place where government and people and jobs and everything is basically perfect. Personally, I think this sounds quite a bit like Neverland, but that's not where we're going with this. One of these new utopian societies was the Society of the Shakers. A shaker is defined as a container with a perforated top from which a seasoning, condiment, sugar, or flour or the like is shaken onto food, or a person or thing that shakes. And a person that shakes would definitely describe the Shakers because they were always doing crazy dances. But in all seriousness, the Shakers were an offshoot of the Quakers, and they loved to shake and they loved to practice celibacy. Actually, they probably didn't love that, but they did it anyway.
The Shakers had their own utopian society where they lived by themselves away from the rest of everybody else.
Other groups took this idea of having their own little societies, such as the Owenites. Another group that had their own little communities was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This wasn't necessarily because they wanted to, but because religious persecution forced them out of New York. Forced out of New York, for religious persecution, and so they tried to set up communities in a couple other places like Missouri and Illinois, but they just kept getting pushed out of wherever they were, and eventually they crossed the Mexican-United States border and settled in Utah. Religious persecution for the LDS people was so bad that their leader, Joseph Smith, and his brother Hiram were both martyred. This map shows the locations of some of those experimental communities.
Now we're going to talk about urban popular culture.
Urban means relating to a city. So urban culture means the culture in the cities.
During the time of the Industrial Revolution in Chapter 9, there were a lot more jobs available. But in Chapter 11, we learned that there were a lot more people in the cities and in the city centers.
So even though the Industrial Revolution back in Chapter 9 created a lot of new jobs, especially in places like factories for both men and women, there were a lot of people that needed jobs.
The jobs that were available for both men and women were really sucky. Like really, really sucky. Young men often worked as clerks or construction workers for very little money, and young women looking for money often turned to, you guessed it, prostitution. Unwilling to endure domestic service or subsistence wages, many young girls turned to prostitution. In the 1850s, Dr. William Sanger carefully surveyed and found 6,000 women engaged in commercial sex. 3/5 of them were native-born whites, and the rest were foreign immigrants. Most were between 15 and 20 years old. Half were or had been domestic servants, half had children, and half were infected with syphilis. On that happy note, urban sexual attitude was one of the things that led to widespread Reformation. Another thing that led to widespread Reformation was the popular plays or minstrelsy that began to turn slightly racist. And by slightly racist, I mean really, really racist. This racist attitude was directed toward German and Irish immigrants, but the majority of the racism was directed at African Americans, both free and slaves. These were the same immigrants who moved to the United States during the Industrial Revolution. Racist books, plays, and attitudes were spread throughout the United States. This led to very hateful feelings toward not white people.
This book cover shows just one example of the racist books being spread throughout the country at this time.
Racism eventually caused the abolition movement, and the Second Great Awakening eventually caused the women's rights movement. The abolition movement was a movement towards the ends of slavery. This wasn't necessarily a movement for equal rights for black people in America. This movement reminds us of what? The Missouri Crisis from Chapter 8.
An abolitionist was someone who advocated against the practice of slavery.
What a lot of people don't realize is that people made a big deal over slavery long before the Civil War. The slave question shows up in both Chapter 8 and Chapter 11, and the Civil War doesn't even show up till Chapter 12. Both the abolition movement and the women's rights movement were mixed with the Second Great Awakening in an almost preachy way. People took to publicly preaching that slavery was a sin and that women needed rights. Both the First and the Second Great Awakening brought new social changes for women. However, the Second Great Awakening brought a lot more changes for women than the first. The slave question was brought up in both the First and the Second Great Awakenings. Though it was a much bigger deal during the Second Great Awakening when people were much less tolerant and a lot more sucky and racist. During the creation of Republican culture, there was a lot of focus on families and children. Whereas during the creation of urban culture, there was a lot more focus on sex and indulgence.
Which eventually led to people thinking that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and so they started doing things like Reformation. Sex wasn't the only thing that they were having the Reformation against. There was also Reformation against tobacco and the way people dressed and alcohol. That was known as the temperance movement. I might be alone in this belief, but I think that maybe Reformation wouldn't be too bad in our society today. Anyway, this movement led to laws such as the alcohol ban. The alcohol ban didn't last forever, and it was the one amendment that we had to amend the amendment and be like, oh, just kidding, we didn't mean that. So, like, go America? Whether you were supportive of the alcohol ban or you were against it, either way it doesn't matter because it doesn't exist anymore. And so we see that the biggest ways that Chapter 8 and Chapter 11 are the same is that they both contain one of the big Great Awakenings. But in Chapter 8, there was a big focus on the creation of Republican culture. In Chapter 11, there's a big focus on the creation of urban culture. Republican culture focused on families and on the role of the women in the home and the ideas of the family, whereas the urban culture focused more on sex and indulgence, and then later what they did because of the sex and indulgence. Chapter 9 and Chapter 11 are very similar because both had lots of new job opportunities for both men and women. However, the opportunities for work in Chapter 9 were typically seamstress or factory work, whereas in Chapter 11 the work was clerk or construction worker or prostitute. The First Great Awakening in Chapter 8 had very little reformation, whereas Chapter 11 with the Second Great Awakening and the abolitionism movement and the women's rights movement had a lot of reformation. Women's rights are discussed in the creation of Republican culture, as well as in the Industrial Revolution, what kinds of jobs are okay for women to have, and then with the women's rights movements in Chapter 11. One thing that Chapter 11 kind of has all by itself that isn't really in Chapter 8 or Chapter 9 was the Reformation movement, a little bit in Chapter 8 with the First Great Awakening, but no. They really just didn't have the Reformations in Chapters 8 or 9 that they do in Chapter 11. There wasn't too much of a women's rights movement, and there definitely wasn't any move to abolish slavery in the previous chapters. But because they didn't have the women's rights movement, they didn't have any arguments about the women's rights movements, and because they didn't have the abolition movement, they didn't have any arguments over the abolition movement. But in the end, people are still people, and they're always going to find something to fight about. Thanks for watching, guys. Smash Course was written by me, the director was me, the producer was also me, the cameraman was sometimes me, and sometimes it was my mom, and sometimes it was my brother. Special thanks to John Green and Hank Green and all of Crash Course for the great idea for this video. You guys are awesome. So, half my video got deleted around midnight, and it's now 2 a.m. and this is it made me very sullen. To put me under much duress. I'm ready to go snuggle in bed.